On the cold morning of December 17, 1944, the stillness of the Belgian Ardennes was shattered by the sound of the German Tiger tank's engines sputtering, choking, and dying one after another. Colonel Hans Peiper stood motionless next to his tank, staring at the empty fuel gauge. His column of 67 tanks and 149 half-tracks, the spearhead of the German offensive in the Ardennes, was stuck in the middle of a barren landscape, helpless. The men around him were equally stunned, each one realizing that their mission had already faltered before it had even begun. Peiper's orders had been clear: push forward, break through the American lines, and capture vital fuel supplies. The operation, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, was Germany's last desperate attempt to turn the tide of war. They were already behind schedule, and fuel shortages had plagued their advance. The tanks were designed to conquer, to roll over their enemies, but now they were nothing more than immobile, helpless giants. As the icy morning fog clung to the ground, the realization hit Peiper hard. The offensive could not succeed without fuel, and they were perilously short. Then, through the mist ahead, he saw it: an American supply depot seemingly abandoned in haste. His eyes narrowed, and his heart quickened. Could this be the break they so desperately needed? He had been taught to believe that victory in this war depended on tactical brilliance, that the Germans were superior in strategy and training. But now, as his boots crunched in the frozen soil, Peiper realized something far more troubling. The enemy could afford to leave behind 50,000 gallons of fuel, enough to fuel an entire division for weeks. The Germans had been fighting with dwindling supplies, using fuel as if it were gold, while the Americans left it behind without a second thought. As Peiper walked toward the depot, the size of the stockpile began to sink in. This was more fuel than his entire group had been allocated for the offensive, more than they had received in months. It was a staggering amount, but instead of joy or triumph, it filled him with unease. The Americans were so rich in resources that they could afford to waste it. What did this mean for Germany's chances? The realization was slow to build, but it was undeniable. Germany was losing not just a battle, but the war itself. The Germans were fighting with everything they had, and the Americans had the luxury of throwing away what they couldn't use. The vast scale of American industrial power, the ability to supply their forces effortlessly, was something the Germans simply could not match. Peiper stood there, surrounded by the fuel cans, watching his men hurriedly refuel the tanks. His thoughts raced as he counted the fuel, the numbers, and the implications of what he was seeing. If the Americans could afford to abandon so much fuel, if they could leave behind resources that were the lifeblood of the war, then their victory was already assured. The German war machine, built on limited resources and a misguided belief in its superiority, was doomed. The offensive was already a failure, not because of military tactics or a lack of courage, but because Germany had misunderstood the very nature of its enemy. Peiper's discovery at Honsfeld was more than just the capture of fuel. It was the moment he realized that the war was lost. Germany had no chance against the industrial might of the United States. The Americans were operating on a scale that Germany could never comprehend, and the gap in resources between the two sides was simply too wide to overcome. For the first time, Peiper understood that this war would not be won on the battlefield. It would be won by factories and refineries, by the ability to produce more than the enemy could destroy. Standing among the captured fuel, the weight of this realization settled heavily on Peiper's shoulders. His column had been halted by fuel shortages, and yet the Americans could burn millions of gallons without a second thought. The realization was both humbling and crushing. He had been taught that the Germans were the superior force, that they could outsmart and outfight any enemy. But the truth was undeniable. They were fighting an enemy whose industrial power dwarfed their own. This was no longer a war of tanks and guns. It was a war of production, and Germany had already lost. The morning of December 17, 1944, was bitterly cold. The mist in Honsfeld clung to the thick trees, the dense fog wrapping the battlefield in a shroud of uncertainty. The German tanks, their massive, imposing guns pointing forward in anticipation, stood motionless on the icy roads. They had come to a halt, their engines sputtering and then dying one by one in the quiet early hours. Colonel Hans Peiper, a young and determined commander of the Waffen-SS, stood beside his immobilized Tiger tank, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His breath, visible in the frigid air, lingered in the atmosphere before dissipating into the mist. The men around him stood in uneasy silence, each one trying to make sense of the situation. The sound of the tank's engines had been replaced by an eerie stillness, punctuated only by the crunch of boots on frozen soil. Peiper had been briefed before the attack. His mission was clear: break through the American lines and advance toward the vital supply depot at the Meuse River, a key strategic point. This was no ordinary attack. It was Germany's final hope to regain the initiative in the West. The operation, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, was designed to split the Allied forces and seize critical supplies. It was a high-stakes gamble, a do-or-die push for the German army, a desperate bid to halt the Allies' steady advance into German territory. Peiper's role in this grand operation was crucial, as his regiment, one of the most elite units in the Waffen-SS, was tasked with leading the charge. In the briefing room, Peiper had listened attentively to the details of the operation. The objective was simple: push through the American defenses, secure the supply lines, and disrupt the Allied advance. The Germans had high hopes that the surprise of the attack would catch the Americans off guard, allowing them to secure vital resources. It was a battle that had to be won if Germany was to maintain any hope of turning the tide of the war. Peiper, though young and relatively inexperienced compared to many of his superiors, had a reputation for quick thinking and decisive action. He was confident in his men, battle-hardened veterans of the Eastern Front who had faced the harshest conditions and emerged victorious time and again. They were used to hardship, and Peiper trusted their resolve. But as the hours passed, the reality of the situation began to set in. The tanks, meant to spearhead the attack, sat in the mist, their massive engines dead from a lack of fuel. Despite the careful planning, despite the precision of the assault, Peiper found himself staring at the empty fuel gauges. His tanks, his pride, were useless without fuel. The engine of the Tiger tank in front of him was silent, and the crew worked desperately to restart it. But nothing happened. The cold was seeping into their bones, and frustration was beginning to rise among the men. The experienced veterans who had expected their supplies to hold now stood motionless, staring at their immobilized vehicles. There was no movement forward. There was no breakthrough. The tanks, once symbols of German power, now sat like inert giants, immobilized by something they could not control. The roar of the engines that had once sent fear into their enemies had been replaced by silence. There was no forward momentum, no crushing attack. Only the sound of boots crunching through the snow and the cold winds that howled across the Ardennes. Peiper's eyes scanned the horizon. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of the situation. The plan had been clear, but the execution was failing. What had gone wrong? The men whispered among themselves, their voices barely audible over the wind. They had all expected better. They had expected to break through, to overrun the American defenses, to seize critical supplies. But now, they were stuck in the frozen landscape, their tanks unable to move. There was no clear explanation for why the situation had turned so dire so quickly. The fuel shortages were more than just a logistical challenge. They were a sign that the very foundation of their military operation was crumbling. The Germans had counted on their fuel supplies to carry them through, but now those supplies were running low, and the promise of victory was slipping further away. And then, through the mist, something caught Peiper's eye. He squinted into the distance, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Ahead of them, nestled in a small clearing, there was an abandoned American supply depot. The sight was almost too good to be true. The depot was a critical point for the Americans, a supply base that could potentially fuel the entire German assault. Peiper's heart began to race as he looked at it. This could be the breakthrough they had been waiting for. It could be the key to winning the battle. The Americans had clearly abandoned the depot in their retreat, leaving behind a massive stockpile of fuel. For a moment, Peiper allowed himself to feel a sense of relief. The Germans had found what they had been desperately searching for: enough fuel to keep the operation going, enough to push forward and continue the offensive. Peiper began to walk toward the depot, his boots crunching in the snow, the tension of the moment weighing heavily on him. But even as his men hurriedly began the process of refueling their tanks, something gnawed at him, a creeping sense of unease. This discovery, so seemingly perfect, felt wrong. Why had the Americans abandoned so much fuel? Was it really as simple as a retreat? Or was there something more at play here? As his men poured the precious fuel into their tanks, Peiper felt a tightening in his chest. The American fuel could give them the power to continue the battle. But something about this moment felt off. The Germans had fought for every drop of fuel for years, scavenging supplies and making do with limited resources. But the Americans, it seemed, had an abundance. The question that was beginning to form in Peiper's mind was unsettling. If the Americans could afford to leave behind so much fuel, so much of what the Germans needed, what did that say about the state of the war? What did it say about their chances? It was a thought that Peiper couldn't shake, one that began to cloud his mind as his men refueled the tanks. The discovery of the fuel was supposed to be a triumph, but now it felt more like a cruel reminder of how far Germany had fallen. As the men finished their work and the engines roared to life once more, Peiper stood still, staring at the depot. This moment, once filled with promise, now felt like a turning point. He had always believed that tactical superiority, combined with German resolve, could overcome any obstacle. But this discovery made it clear. Germany was not just fighting against the Allies. They were fighting an enemy whose resources, whose sheer industrial capacity, dwarfed their own. Peiper's mind raced. The American retreat, the abandoned depot. It wasn't just a strategic move. It was a signal that the war was no longer just a matter of battle and tactics. It was a matter of production, and in that realm, Germany was hopelessly outmatched. Peiper turned back to his tank, the roar of the engines now filling the air. The men were ready to move forward, but Peiper was lost in thought. He had come into this operation believing in the power of German might, in the strength of their military. But the sight of the fuel, the sheer scale of the American logistical effort, had shaken him. They were not just fighting for territory or control. They were fighting a battle that had already been decided by industrial might. For the first time, Peiper realized the grim truth. Germany's defeat was already inevitable. The morning fog in Honsfeld seemed to deepen the weight of the moment. Colonel Hans Peiper stood, hands clasped behind his back, watching as his men worked feverishly to refuel the tanks. His gaze moved from one soldier to the next as they lifted jerry cans, pouring precious fuel into the vehicles that had been silent for far too long. The powerful hum of the engine starting up again was a relief, but it also left Peiper with a sense of unease. His men had been fighting for every drop of fuel for months. They had eked out each victory at great cost, managing with little more than scraps while the Allies advanced with the overwhelming might of a fully operational supply chain. Now, standing in front of the abandoned American depot, it felt almost surreal that the tide of fortune had turned so abruptly. The Americans had left behind more fuel than the entire German division had seen in months, neatly stacked in jerry cans, untouched and waiting to be claimed. For a moment, Peiper almost allowed himself to believe that luck had finally swung in their favor. It was as if the enemy had handed them the victory they had desperately needed. But even as his men continued their work, Peiper's thoughts wandered back to the briefings he had attended in the days leading up to the offensive. The mission had been laid out clearly: break through the American lines, capture key supply depots, and split the Allied forces. It had been an ambitious plan, one that hinged on speed and surprise, designed to exploit any weaknesses the Allies might have left behind in their rapid retreat. The orders from General Dietrich had been blunt and unequivocal: capture American supplies at all costs. The logistics were simple enough. The Germans would advance, seizing any fuel reserves along the way, relying on quick raids to sustain their armored thrusts. It was a high-risk strategy, but the Germans had no choice. The Allies had been advancing relentlessly, and the war was quickly turning against them. This operation was their last shot at regaining the initiative, and every tank, every truck, every soldier counted. They had gambled everything on this one offensive. But as Peiper watched his men working in the morning light, his mind began to churn. The more he thought about the mission, the more he realized how flawed it had become. The strategy had been drawn up with confidence, but it was dependent on the idea that the Americans would be caught off guard, their supply lines vulnerable. The Germans had believed they could disrupt the American war effort by seizing key fuel depots. But here they were, in Honsfeld, surrounded by more fuel than they had ever hoped to find. It seemed like a blessing, but it didn't feel right. The Americans had retreated from this depot in haste, leaving behind everything. It was too easy, and that easy victory made Peiper suspicious. The Americans had planned their retreat, and yet they had left enough fuel behind to keep the German tanks rolling for days. In that moment, Peiper couldn't help but question the scale of the American logistical machine. It was overwhelming. He had seen it firsthand in Honsfeld, an entire depot of fuel, untouched, a resource that was beyond anything the Germans could have hoped for. How had the Americans let this happen? Were they truly this careless, or was there something more? Peiper's mind was consumed with this thought as he watched his men finish refueling the tanks. He had heard of the American supply lines stretching across Europe, the constant flow of fuel, ammunition, and supplies that kept the Allies moving forward. But seeing it up close made it clear that what he had been told about American logistics was not just propaganda. It was the brutal truth. The Allies had built a machine of war that could not be stopped. The fuel in Honsfeld was just a fraction of the supplies the Americans had at their disposal, a mere glimpse into the vast, well-oiled operation that Germany simply couldn't match. The realization gnawed at Peiper. He had always believed that the Germans, with their superior training and strategic brilliance, would outsmart their enemies. But here, in Honsfeld, it became clear that the enemy was not just smarter, it was stronger, more prepared, and better equipped. The scale of the American logistical effort dwarfed anything Germany had ever built. The Allies didn't just win battles. They won them with an industrial might that Germany could never hope to replicate. The discovery of this fuel depot should have been a triumphant moment, but it had the opposite effect on Peiper. It made him realize the staggering imbalance between their forces. Peiper stood still for a moment, the rumble of the refueled tanks rising in the background, his thoughts a whirlwind. The operation was meant to be the decisive blow, the one that would turn the tide of the war. But the discovery of the fuel in Honsfeld only revealed the truth that had been hiding in plain sight. Germany was already on the losing side. They had miscalculated the nature of the war, assuming it could be won with tactics and surprise. But the real strength lay in the ability to sustain the fight, to keep the machines running, and to never run out of supplies. The Allies had that in spades, while Germany had spent years scraping by, patching together an army with the bare minimum. As the tanks roared to life and the men climbed aboard, preparing to push forward, Peiper's unease lingered. The plan was still in motion, and they would continue the offensive. But as they moved out from Honsfeld, the realization had set in. This wasn't just about tanks and soldiers anymore. It was about production, about resources, about the ability to feed the war machine. The Germans, for all their valor and tactical brilliance, were fighting against an enemy whose industrial might was unmatched. The war had shifted, and as they pushed forward, Peiper couldn't shake the sinking feeling that they were already fighting a losing battle. Peiper walked carefully through the rows of jerry cans stacked neatly in the depot, the rusted metal gleaming in the dull morning light. The smell of gasoline hung in the air, sharp and pungent. His boots crunched on the gravel as he moved between the towering piles of fuel containers, each one holding 5 gallons of high-octane gasoline. There was enough here to sustain his entire regiment, enough to give his men the momentum they needed to push forward. The discovery of 50,000 gallons of fuel should have been a victory, a sudden stroke of fortune, a rare piece of good luck in the middle of an otherwise grim operation. Yet, as Peiper continued to walk among the supplies, the weight of the moment began to press down on him. The fuel was significant, yes, but in the grand scheme of things, it was nothing. The Germans had been struggling for resources throughout the war, constantly grappling with shortages in fuel, ammunition, and basic supplies. The entire war had been a battle not just of weapons and tactics, but of logistics. Germany had tried to fight a modern war using outdated infrastructure, relying on synthetic fuel that was vulnerable to Allied bombing campaigns. Meanwhile, the Americans had built an empire of industrial might, one that stretched across Europe, with the ability to produce more oil, more ammunition, and more tanks than Germany could even imagine. Peiper paused and surveyed the depot, the rows of fuel stretching out before him like an ocean. His eyes scanned the carefully stacked cans, the faint clink of metal as his men continued their work in the background. The moment should have been triumphant. They had found the lifeblood they needed to keep the offensive going. But Peiper couldn't shake the thought that began to form in his mind as he took in the sight. Even with all of this, even with 50,000 gallons at their disposal, this fuel would only allow them to reach the next step. It would not guarantee success, and it certainly wouldn't change the course of the war. As he walked further into the depot, his mind turned back to the broader picture. The sheer scale of the American logistical system was overwhelming. This small depot in Honsfeld, though crucial, was just a single part of an immense network that spanned the continent. The Americans had built entire pipelines that ran across France, and even under the English Channel, feeding their forces with an endless supply of oil. The numbers were staggering. In 1944, the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, in contrast, could barely scrape together 33 million barrels. Even after the Germans had begun capturing the Romanian oil fields, the disparity in oil production between the two nations was immense. The American capacity to sustain its war effort dwarfed Germany's. It was a war not just of men and machines, but of industrial output, and in that domain, Germany had already lost. Peiper's mind raced as he processed the implications of what he had just discovered. The fuel here, though enough to keep his tanks running for a while, was just a fraction of what the Americans had at their disposal. The scale of the American supply system, its network of fuel depots, pipelines, and truck convoys, was unlike anything Germany could comprehend. As his men continued to work, fueling up the tanks and preparing to move forward, Peiper looked at the maps that had been captured from the Americans. The supply routes were clearly marked, and there was a staggering number of depots. Fuel supplies at every major crossroads, every strategic point. The Americans had made sure that no matter how much the Germans captured, the Allies could always replenish their supplies. The fuel Peiper had just found, though important, was ultimately inconsequential. Even if they captured every depot in their path, it would not change the fundamental imbalance between the two forces. The realization began to sink in. The Germans had gambled everything on this offensive, hoping to gain a crucial victory, to disrupt the Allied supply lines and turn the tide of the war. But in the face of such overwhelming industrial might, Peiper couldn't help but wonder what chance they had. The Americans were not just an enemy to be defeated on the battlefield, they were a machine of war that could not be stopped. The production capabilities of the United States were staggering, and it was clear that the Germans had underestimated this aspect of the war. They had assumed that, like past conflicts, victory could be won through superior tactics, bold maneuvers, and the will of the soldiers. But now, standing in the midst of this fuel depot, Peiper realized that the war was not being fought on the battlefield alone. It was being fought in factories and refineries, in assembly lines that churned out the tools of war at an unimaginable scale. As his men continued their work, Peiper's gaze remained fixed on the stacks of fuel. He could see the Americans' strategy laid out before him, a strategy based on abundance and sustainability. The Allies were not concerned with one small depot being captured. They had reserves everywhere, a seemingly endless supply that could sustain their armies for as long as necessary. The Germans, on the other hand, were fighting with dwindling resources. They had to make every drop of fuel count, every tank last as long as possible. The equation was simple. Germany could not sustain a war of attrition against an enemy with limitless resources. The discovery of this depot, though it seemed like a small victory, only highlighted the growing realization that Germany was on the losing side. The more Peiper thought about it, the more the scale of the situation became clear. The Americans could afford to waste fuel, destroying it, leaving it behind, or sending it to the front lines in massive quantities. The Germans, on the other hand, had been fighting to conserve every drop, using fuel with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. In that moment, Peiper understood that Germany was facing an enemy that could afford to fight in a way they never could. The fuel in Honsfeld would allow them to move forward, but the real battle, the battle for resources, was one Germany had already lost. As his men finished refueling the tanks and preparing to advance, Peiper took one last look at the depot. It was a small victory, but it was a hollow one. The true cost of the war had become apparent to him. It wasn't just about fighting battles. It was about who could sustain the fight. The Americans, with their industrial might, were in a position to win the war not through tactical brilliance, but through their sheer ability to produce and sustain the effort. Germany, meanwhile, was fighting a losing battle. It was a reality that Peiper couldn't escape. And as he turned back to his tank, ready to move forward, he knew that the war was no longer just about who had the better soldiers. It was about who could keep the fight going, and in that, Germany had already lost. As the morning wore on, the sound of engines humming to life filled the air as Peiper's tanks were refueled. His men worked quickly, using the precious fuel they had discovered to prepare for the next phase of their assault. But as the task was completed, Peiper stood still, watching his men with a distant gaze. The weight of the situation began to sink in. The sight of the fuel barrels, the tanks now ready for action, these should have been signs of victory. Yet, in the back of his mind, Peiper couldn't shake the growing realization that the war was being decided by something far beyond the realm of tactics and strategy. He had spent his entire career believing that victory in warfare came from clever maneuvering, the surprise of an unexpected attack, and the resolve of soldiers who were determined to win. He had been trained to think that Germany's superiority in tactical operations would overcome the limitations of their supply lines. That skill on the battlefield could make up for what was lacking in resources. For years, this belief had served him and his comrades well, allowing them to achieve victories where others had failed. But now, standing amidst the captured fuel, Peiper began to understand a truth that was impossible to ignore. The war was no longer just about tactics. It was about production. The ability to manufacture the machines of war, the power to sustain armies with an unrelenting flow of resources, was what decided the outcome of conflicts on this scale. The Americans had an industrial machine that could produce more than anyone could imagine. It wasn't just about the tanks or the planes or the soldiers. It was about the factories that churned out weapons, ammunition, fuel, and supplies at a scale Germany could never match. The realization hit Peiper hard as he thought back to the briefings he had attended just days earlier. General Dietrich had spoken confidently, outlining the strategy to break through the American defenses and seize critical supply depots. The plan had seemed sound at the time. The Germans would take what the Americans had left behind, capture their fuel reserves, and keep their army moving forward. But now, in the midst of the refueling operation, the sheer scale of the American logistical power was apparent to Peiper. The American war machine was not just about tactics. It was an unstoppable force fueled by a never-ending supply of resources. Peiper's eyes scanned the depot again. The fuel they had found in Honsfeld was crucial, yes, but it was still only a fraction of what the Americans had at their disposal. It was clear now that the Americans had the capacity to keep fighting indefinitely. Every major road, every key point in the conflict zone, was connected by a web of pipelines and supply routes. The Americans were not just fighting. They were sustaining their efforts at a scale that Germany simply could not hope to match. The realization struck him like a blow to the gut. The Americans had the resources to keep their machines running, to outlast any offensive the Germans could muster, no matter how brilliant the tactics. Peiper thought back to the briefing once again. General Dietrich had spoken about the importance of capturing fuel and supplies, and how this operation would depend on the Germans breaking through quickly before the Americans had a chance to reorganize. But now, standing in the middle of this small depot, Peiper could see the truth. The Germans had gambled everything on this one chance, believing that the Americans could be caught off guard, their supply lines vulnerable. The entire offensive had been based on this assumption. And yet, here they were, surrounded by more fuel than they had ever dreamed of. And yet it still felt like they were losing. The more Peiper thought about it, the clearer it became. The Americans weren't just fighting a war, they were running a system that could keep fueling the war effort long after Germany had exhausted its reserves. The contrast between the two sides became painfully evident. Germany, with its limited industrial capacity, was forced to rely on tactical brilliance to make up for what it lacked in resources. The Americans, on the other hand, didn't need to rely on tactics alone. They had an endless supply of the materials necessary to win a war. Every gallon of fuel the Germans captured was nothing more than a drop in the ocean of what the Americans had at their disposal. The entire strategy that the Germans had built their hopes upon was based on the assumption that they could disrupt the American supply lines, that they could force the Allies into a position where their logistics would falter. But instead, the Americans had simply moved their supply lines, and with them, their strength. The war was already lost, not because of tactical failures or strategic mistakes, but because of a fundamental mismatch in resources. Peiper could feel his mind racing, unable to reconcile the reality of the situation with what he had been taught for so long. He had been raised to believe in the power of strategy, that a well-executed plan could overcome even the greatest obstacles. But now, standing amidst the fuel barrels, he realized that the outcome of this war had already been determined long before the first shots were fired. It wasn't just about fighting harder or smarter. It was about having the ability to sustain the fight. The Americans had that ability in abundance, while Germany had been fighting on empty for years. The discovery of the fuel in Honsfeld had been an unexpected boon, but it also served as a stark reminder of the reality they faced. The Germans were outmatched, outnumbered, and outproduced. As the men finished refueling and began to prepare for the next leg of the journey, Peiper's sense of unease deepened. He could still hear the roar of the engines as they came to life once more, and yet the sound felt hollow in his ears. The tanks were ready to move, but Peiper knew that no matter how hard they fought, it wouldn't be enough. The war had become a battle of resources, and in that contest, Germany simply didn't stand a chance. He had always believed that Germany's superior military tactics could overcome any obstacle, but now he realized that it wasn't about tactics at all. It was about the ability to keep fighting, to keep moving forward, and in that, the Americans were unbeatable. The offensive continued, but as Peiper surveyed the men preparing to advance, he knew in his heart that the war was already lost. The realization was crushing, but it was impossible to ignore. The Germans had fought valiantly, but in the end, they were fighting an enemy whose industrial power could not be overcome by sheer will. The war was no longer about military superiority. It was about who could keep their forces supplied and moving. And in that, the Americans had already won. The realization of the overwhelming imbalance in resources weighed heavily on Colonel Peiper. It had become clear that this operation was not the decisive victory they had once hoped for, but rather a desperate struggle to stay afloat in a war that was slipping beyond their control. As the tanks roared to life, fueled by the unexpected discovery at Honsfeld, Peiper tried to push his thoughts aside, focusing instead on the immediate task at hand. The mission had to continue, no matter the growing sense of futility. But even as he issued orders to advance, a subtle shift had taken place in his mind. No longer was this operation about victory or breaking through the American lines. It was now about survival. The enemy was no longer just an opposing force. The true enemy was the overwhelming industrial power of the United States, a machine that seemed invincible. Peiper's thoughts churned as he watched his men prepare for the next phase of the operation. The initial thrill of discovering a cache of fuel had quickly faded into the harsh reality of their situation. The fuel they had found was a mere temporary lifeline, one that could keep them going for only so long. As his tanks began to move again, the gravity of the situation sunk in deeper. Each mile that passed, each minute that ticked away, brought them closer to the inevitable realization that they were out of time. They had been pushing forward with the belief that if they could just capture enough supplies, they could keep the war machine rolling. But now, the discovery at Honsfeld had shattered that illusion. The Americans had already burned millions of gallons of fuel, and their reserves stretched far beyond anything the Germans could capture. It became clear to Peiper that the only thing the Germans were really fighting for now was the hope of surviving just one more day. As the convoy moved out, the mood among the men had changed. There was no longer the same confident determination in their steps. The men who had once marched forward with the belief that victory was within reach now walked with uncertainty in their eyes. They had seen the scale of the American supply system, and it was clear that no matter how much fuel they could capture, it would never be enough. The once optimistic soldiers were now weary, their spirits dampened by the growing realization that the odds were stacked against them. They were fighting not for a victory, but to keep moving, to hold on to what little they had. The relentless forward march that had characterized the early stages of the operation now felt like a slow, reluctant crawl. Peiper, too, felt the weight of this change. The decisions he had made up until now, the strategies he had relied on, had all been based on the assumption that Germany could overcome its lack of resources with superior tactics. But now, standing in the midst of an operation that seemed doomed to fail, he knew that tactical brilliance could only take them so far. The war was no longer about being clever or outsmarting the enemy. It was about who could sustain the fight. And Germany, despite its military prowess, simply could not sustain the fight the way the Americans could. Every fuel depot they captured, every gallon of gasoline they obtained, was a temporary solution to a problem that had no permanent fix. Peiper's mind raced as the convoy pushed deeper into enemy territory. The men were exhausted, the tanks strained, and the fuel reserves were dwindling. The advance toward the Meuse River, once a bold and confident plan, now seemed like an impossible task. The American logistical system, with its pipelines and convoys, was a juggernaut that could not be stopped. Even if they captured every supply depot in their path, the Americans would simply deliver more, faster than the Germans could ever hope to capture. As Peiper moved forward with his men, the harsh truth settled in. They were racing against an enemy who didn't have to fight to win. They could afford to simply outlast them. The Americans had the capacity to keep fighting indefinitely, replenishing their forces with ease. Meanwhile, the Germans were running on fumes, both literally and figuratively. The supply lines that had once been the backbone of the German war effort had been severed, and the reserves that Germany had relied on for so long were rapidly depleting. No longer could they hope to win this war through audacity or tactical superiority. They would have to fight simply to survive. The sense of urgency now permeated every decision Peiper made. He could no longer afford to think about outflanking the enemy or breaking through their defenses. He had to think about keeping his men alive, keeping the tanks running, and finding the next depot before their fuel ran out. The Americans had burned fuel, destroyed supply depots, and cut off every route of escape, forcing the Germans into a corner. No matter how many small victories they claimed, no matter how many American tanks they destroyed, the reality was clear. The war had already been decided by the scale of industrial power, not the skill of the soldiers on the battlefield. Peiper looked out across the men in his regiment. Once, they had marched with the hope of reclaiming lost ground, of winning back territory for the Reich. But now, they marched with the realization that their hope for victory was gone. They weren't fighting to win anymore. They were fighting to survive, to stretch out the inevitable collapse for as long as they could. The industrial strength of the United States had rendered the German war effort a futile endeavor. The resources, the manpower, the logistics, the sheer weight of it all was more than Germany could ever match. The once proud soldiers of the Waffen-SS, men who had once believed in the invincibility of their cause, now found themselves in a struggle for survival. Each day was a battle against not just the enemy, but the reality that their army was running on empty, that their supplies were exhausted, and that their hope for victory had long since vanished. As the convoy moved forward through the snow-covered landscape, Peiper's resolve remained, but it had shifted. No longer did he think about grand victories or breakthroughs. Now he thought only about getting to the next fuel depot, about stretching their dwindling resources just a little bit further. The war was no longer about conquest. It was about endurance. And in that battle of endurance, the Germans were already losing. The days dragged on as the cold weather continued to bite at the men and the equipment. What had started as a mission full of bold hopes now felt like an impossible struggle against the inevitable. As the German forces pushed deeper into the Ardennes, the fuel situation, once manageable, became a crippling reality. Peiper had watched his men scramble to keep the tanks moving, but it was becoming clear that the vital resource, fuel, was running out faster than they could capture it. The tanks that had once powered through the landscape with determination now sat idle, their engines silent, their guns still. The roar of battle was slowly being replaced by the sound of the wind howling through empty vehicles, the silence serving as a grim reminder of the enemy they faced, an enemy whose ability to sustain its forces could not be matched. The German forces had managed to reach key positions, had fought their way through the snow and mud to get this far, but there was nothing left to give them the final push. They were trapped in a brutal cycle. The tanks, which should have been advancing, were now abandoned, left behind as their fuel tanks ran dry. The men pushed forward on foot, carrying out the orders to continue, to hold on, to push toward the Meuse, but the dream of victory had long since evaporated. They were fighting against a far more dangerous adversary than the American soldiers. They were fighting against the logistics, the resources, and the unrelenting industrial power of the Allies. It had become clear, no matter how many tactical victories they won on the battlefield, they could not win the war with an empty tank. Meanwhile, the Americans moved with an ease that the Germans could only watch and envy. The tanks and trucks of the U.S. Army were powered by a seemingly endless supply of fuel. Their machines were never immobilized, never abandoned. The American supply lines stretched across the continent, constantly replenishing their forces with the fuel they needed to keep fighting. There was no pause for the Americans, no moment when their advance was slowed because they ran out of resources. The Germans, in contrast, were operating on fumes. Every captured fuel depot, every barrel of gasoline they could seize, was a temporary solution to a much deeper problem, an issue that could not be resolved by capturing enemy supplies. The truth was undeniable. The Germans had reached the end of their ability to continue. They had run out of everything that truly mattered: time, resources, and the ability to sustain the war. As December 23rd approached, the situation grew even more dire. The German forces had been surrounded, their tanks left helpless in the snow, their engines cold and silent. What had once been a rapid advance had now become a standoff, with no possibility of further movement. The mission, which had started as a hopeful and calculated offensive, had failed. It was no longer about who had the better strategy or the more battle-hardened troops. It was about who could endure, who could keep the fight going. And in that, the Allies had already won. The German forces were running on empty, unable to move without fuel, unable to sustain the battle for much longer. The American forces, meanwhile, could afford to keep fighting indefinitely. In the days that followed, the reality of the defeat became clear. The Germans had thrown everything into this operation, hoping that the capture of fuel, ammunition, and strategic positions would be enough to secure a victory. But the discovery of the 50,000 gallons of fuel at Honsfeld had been a cruel reminder of how fleeting their success was. The fuel they had captured, enough to keep their tanks running for a few days, had provided a temporary reprieve, but it hadn't solved the deeper problem of Germany's dwindling industrial capacity. For the Allies, fuel was abundant, and their forces could move without pause. For the Germans, every drop of fuel was precious, and once it was gone, so too was their ability to fight. The story of Honsfeld, which had seemed like a small victory in the midst of desperation, became a tragic reminder of the war's true nature. It wasn't the soldiers on the battlefield who decided the outcome of the war. It was the factories and refineries, the industrial machines that could churn out weapons and fuel faster than the Germans could capture it. In the face of America's industrial might, Germany's strength in battle seemed irrelevant. The tanks, the weapons, the men. They were all secondary to the resources that kept them running. And in that, the Germans were hopelessly outmatched. By December 23rd, Peiper had come to a brutal realization. This war had already been lost long before the first tanks were deployed in the Ardennes. It had been decided not on the battlefield, not in the tactical maneuvers and the clashes between soldiers, but in the factories where war machines were built, in the refineries where fuel was produced, and in the supply lines that kept the American forces moving forward. The Germans had miscalculated. They had believed they could win by being smarter, faster, and more aggressive. But in the face of overwhelming industrial capacity, the strategy was futile. No matter how many tanks they captured, no matter how many positions they gained, the Allies had an advantage that the Germans could not overcome. As the German forces began to retreat, the full extent of their failure became evident. Tanks were abandoned, their crews moving on foot, trying to salvage what they could as they fell back from the front lines. The men who had once marched forward with pride, believing in their ability to outmaneuver the enemy, now moved with uncertainty. The same soldiers who had driven their tanks through the mud, the snow, and the blood of battle now found themselves defeated, not by their enemies, but by the industrial forces they could not comprehend. The resources, the sheer abundance of fuel and supplies, were no longer a distant abstraction. They had seen it firsthand, and it was clear. The Allies' industrial might had made victory impossible. The story of the Battle of the Bulge, of the offensive that had begun with so much promise and so much desperation, ended not with a final heroic stand, but with the realization that the war was already lost. The Germans had fought valiantly, but it was a fight they could never win. The industrial machine of the Allies had already decided the outcome. In the end, it wasn't the soldiers who fought the war. It was the factories, the pipelines, and the supply lines that determined who would win and who would lose. And as the last German tanks were abandoned and the men began their retreat, they knew, deep down, that the outcome had been sealed long before they had ever set foot on the battlefield. The war was no longer about who fought harder. It was about who could sustain the fight. And in that, the Germans were already defeated.